We now move to debate on clauses 18 to 48 and schedules 2 to 4. The question is that part 3 stand part.
Mr Chairman.
Phil Twyford.
Mr Chairman, I am disappointed that parties who are voting for this bill are not taking calls in this debate. Not only are we in the situation yet again of this national government taking away the freedoms of New Zealanders under urgency, but even worse, the members on the government side are not even game enough to get up and take a call.
Can't use that word. Just asked to withdraw that word. And
I withdraw. Sir.
Yes, Phil Twyford.
I just think it's a shame, Mr Chairman, that the government members won't get up and take a call and explain themselves. The ACT Party, who are the great defenders of our freedoms and liberties, haven't even made a contribution in this debate, but they're quite content to vote for this nasty, odious, bureaucratic little bill that takes away the freedoms of New Zealanders to enjoy the great outdoors. And I urge Hilary Calvert to get up and take a call, because as we know, the ACT members aren't whipped on these things. It doesn't matter that Rodney Hyde has promised this bill to the councils, to local government New Zealand. That member has the freedom to stand up and express a view, and I urge you to do that. I think it's a shame, sir, that the Māori Party yet again are voting for a nasty, sordid little bill like this, and the best they can do is put up an SOP inserting a treaty clause. It's exactly what we've seen time and time again. They'll vote for a lousy little bill like this, and they'll try to ameliorate the situation by proposing the insertion of a treaty clause. Well, it's just not good enough. Sir, I want to speak to our supplementary order paper that deals with the question of the seizing and impounding of boats, caravans, motor vehicles and other property, because this actually illustrates, sir, just how pernicious this bill is. And what the provisions around clause 35 do is that they give extraordinary powers for dock and council officers to seize property that has been used in the commission of offences under this new regime. And I submit, sir, that the powers are completely out of proportion to the offences that are being dealt with by this bill. They are draconian, and actually, sir, I think that there's a risk that they are so out of whack with the offences that this bill seeks to deal with that they could do serious damage to our tourism industry. If people come to this country from around the world to experience our country's most beautiful places, to do it in a spirit of freedom, and they find that their car or their property is impounded and seized and forfeited under this bill, that would send a very, very unfortunate signal to our international visitors. I want to refer to the advice from the Legislation Advisory Committee, which raised some really serious concerns about the seizure powers. And raised two main concerns. They said that the purpose of the seizure provisions in the bill is less than clear, and secondly, that it's not clear that the objectives will necessarily be achieved through the provisions as they are currently drafted. They point out that the reasoning behind the higher threshold that's given to the seizing of things like boats, caravans and campervans. There's a series of tests that have to be passed. They can only seize those large items, house trucks, boats, caravans, cars, if the officer is satisfied on reasonable grounds that the seizure is necessary to avoid risks to the health of the public, the safety of the public and so on and so forth. What it does actually, it sets up a two-tier test which actually creates a perverse incentive for people to infringe under this regime in a tent, but not in a house truck. And as Sir Geoffrey Palmer points out in this advice, that is illogical and inconsistent.
The house truck's okay.
That's right. Well, it's much more difficult to have your property impounded if it's a boat or a house truck. Actually, there's a much lower threshold, a much lower test that has to be passed if you choose to break the law, to break this law in a tent.
Wow.
Doesn't make any sense at all.
That's consistent.
What's more, the Legislation Advisory Committee says, Mr Chairman, that clause 37, dealing with the return of seized property, is also problematic. And in fact, what it would do is that it would place the onus on the person who's had their property seized to establish that it will not be used for future offending. And as the advice from the Legislation Advisory Committee makes clear, that may be difficult to do. The likelihood of property being retained and disposed of essentially means this is a forfeiture regime. It's not about seizing and impounding property. It sets up a de facto forfeiture regime. This is one of the most draconian aspects of the bill. It has no place in this bill. It is completely disproportionate to the scale of the offences that we are talking about. And I invite the Minister to think again about the seizure and impounding provisions in this bill. It will bring this House into disrepute for the law to be, this bill to be passed in its current form. And I would like to hear from the Minister her response to the detailed and thoughtful submission made by Sir Geoffrey Palmer as the Chair of the Legislation Advisory Committee. Sir, there are two other SOPs that Labor has put on the table for this debate. One is the issue that where the offence is associated with a particular vehicle, that any subsequent fine can be levied against the owner of that vehicle. And I note that the Minister has brought a similar SOP. And in a way, I'm kind of glad to see it, because it makes sense that rental companies have the ability to pass on fines to the offenders. But our concern is that would be fine if this was an infringement regime that was set up to target the dumping of waste and littering. But to harness it to an infringement regime that deals with freedom camping is completely over the top. And to put those two things together, that is the reason why we keep saying that this bill is draconian. So we would support the amendment that allows the owners of these vehicles to have those fines passed on to them by the rental companies, but not if it's for a regime that includes penalising people for freedom camping. We would only support it for offences that are relating to the dumping of waste and littering. And that, sir, is why we've also proposed an amendment to clause 18, which would remove the offence of freedom camping from this bill and would leave simply the offence of littering and waste. It's the creating of the offence of freedom camping that is the problem with this bill. That is the provision in this bill that will lead undoubtedly to innocent New Zealanders being criminalised simply because they are freedom camping in the way that they have for generations and think that they should be entitled to. And it's our argument that if this bill focused on the actual problem, which is the leaving of waste and litter, and other practical measures were implemented, as my colleague Damien O'Connor has said, and Marion Street has said, that if other infrastructure was put in place, bins and waste facilities in places where they're needed, then those practical measures would be enough to deal with most of the problem. I'll leave it there. Thank you.